may I have your attention, please? So welcome to the Indonesia Study Group seminar today. First, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional land we meet and pay our respect to the elders past and present. Today we'll be talking about Indonesia's industrial policy, downstreaming, and EV supply chain. And we're grateful to have two distinguished speakers from Lowy Institute. So Pak Hilman Palawan is a research fellow at the Lowy Institute in the Institute's Indo-Pacific Development Center. He has extensive experience in Indonesia, particularly in advancing the financial inclusion agenda and digitizing social protection programs during his tenure at the TNP2K, or the National Team for the Acceleration of Poverty Reduction in Indonesia, the Vice President Office in Indonesia. And Robert Walker is a research associate at the Lowy Institute and works as an economist in the Institute's Indo-Pacific Development Center. His works focus on emerging Asian economies, as well as growth and development in the Indo-Pacific region. Robert's interests include macroeconomic policy and development, geoeconomics, and Indo-Pacific and European international political economy. So over to Hilman.
Thank you, Joe, for the introduction. Good day, Canberra, and good morning, Jakarta, and warm welcome to everyone joining us both in online and present in Canberra. We appreciate your taking time to join us in today's seminar. A special thanks to the ANU Crawford School of Public Policy, the Indonesia Project, ISG, Indonesia Study Group, for their support in facilitating this discussion. We are from the Lowy Institute, an Australian think tank based in Sydney, and we are excited to present our latest research on Indonesia's industrial policy, downstreaming, and EV supply chain. Let me take a look at our agenda for today's discussion. We will begin with the overview of the background, where I'll provide the context of our research on industrial policy and Indonesia's downstreaming agenda. Next, I'll move to the research details. This section will outline the objectives of our study, the key research questions we sought to answer, and the research methodology we applied during the study. Of course, I will also highlight about the timeline of the research. And not to forget, I would like to highlight about the focus of our research on the specific provinces in Indonesia that we visited. Following that, I will give a highlight about the findings based on our initial analysis, drawing from the secondary sources as well as our interviews in Indonesia. And next, Rob will continue will take the stage to present a deeper dive into the analysis and also provide the policy recommendations. Let's start about the industrial policy. So industrial policy plays a crucial role in shaping the economic landscape. The primary goal of industrial policy includes diversifying economies, creating jobs, enhancing economic competitiveness, strengthening supply chains, fostering innovation, and bolstering national security. Each of these elements is essential for ensuring sustainable growth and resilience in today's rapidly evolving global economy. Building on this framework, the green industrial policy has evolved. This approach prioritizes achieving net zero emissions and advancing environmental sustainability. It promotes the use of renewable energy sources, the development of green energy technologies, and the establishment of green industries. Significantly, it also aims to create green jobs that support a sustainable future. Our research focused on the three key areas. Number one is about the critical mineral downstreaming. This involves exploring the processing and utilization of nickel and other critical minerals, which are essential for the various green industries. And the next one is about the electric vehicle supply chain, the EV supply chain. We examine about the EV supply chain, highlighting the importance of these sectors in Indonesia's industrialization. The third one, Indonesia serves as our case study in our research, as it faces a unique challenges and opportunities in implementing the green industrial policy. A bit background about Indonesia's agenda. So since its independence in 1945, Indonesia has pursued targeted government intervention in its economy to achieve national objectives. These interventions, while often sometimes controversial, have played a crucial role in shaping the country's economic trajectory. Over the years, the country has used the industrial policy as a tool to foster economic growth, although the results somehow have been mixed. Looking forward, Indonesia has set an ambitious target to become a high-income country by 2045. This vision is built on the several pillars. One of the most important is being the development of high-value industries. One of the key areas of focus in Indonesia's current industrial policies is downstreaming. The government is looking to shift from exporting raw material to adding value domestically. The shift is being driven through subsidies and incentives, and also the export bans, which aim to encourage domestic value-added production. The focus here is on critical minerals, particularly nickel. These materials are the heart of modern technologies and are increasingly important for national security. One of the key goals is to develop a fully integrated EV ecosystem in the country, positioning Indonesia as a potential leader in the global EV supply chain. For over a decade, Indonesia has focused on downstreaming through a combination of export restriction and investment incentives. The strategy was solidified with the introduction of the 2019 Mineral and Coal Mining Law, which allowed the government to assert greater control over the mining resources. And more recently, regulation have intensified with export bans and taxes being implemented to encourage foreign investment in domestic processing industries. About our research. So our primary objective in our research is in twofold. The first one is we aim to identify strategies for Indonesia to excel in the global nickel and EV supply chains. The second one, we seek to ensure the successful implementation of green industrial policies that can drive sustainable development. To guide the research, we have formulated 4 research questions. The first one, how effective has Indonesia's green industrial policy been in boosting nickel processing and the EV industry? This question explored the outcomes of the policies in place. We have analyzed whether the policies such as subsidies and export restriction have effectively supported the growth of both the nickel processing sector and the emerging of EV ecosystem. The second one, what are the trade-offs of Indonesia's industrial policy? Is it a truly green industrial policy? While Indonesia's industrial policy emphasizes sustainable development, it is essential to assess the broader environmental and also economic implications. Are the strategy truly green in their execution? We look into potential trade-offs in the strategy, such as environmental concern, local communities, and other potential spillovers. The third one, what is the potential for applying nickel's downstreaming strategy to other critical minerals? Given the focus on nickel, we examine whether the downstreaming strategy that has been applied to nickel could be replicated to other critical minerals. In this case, we take a bauxite as an example. Finally, what policy decisions are needed to enhance the global competitiveness of Indonesia's nickel and EV industries? The final question is more looking ahead of the potential of Indonesia's policy recommendations, where we try to analyze the policy decisions that could further strengthen Indonesia's position in global nickel and also EV markets. Moving ahead to our research methodology, we conduct our research. We employed the mixed method approach. We use the mixed methods. We do the quantitative and qualitative analysis, and also we are using Indonesia as a case study. For the data collection, the quantitative data was gathered from the several resources, like the United States Geological Survey, CEIC, FDI Markets, ASEAN Statistics, Statistic Indonesia, or BPS, Indonesia Investment Coordinating Board, Indonesia Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources. Whereas for the qualitative, we conducted interviews and also direct observation in nickel and smelter industries, in nickel and smelters areas in Indonesia. For our analysis, we applied several techniques. We used descriptive statistics to summarize the data and highlight the key patterns that we found out. The time series analysis helped us to understand trends over the time. And finally, we conducted a sectoral assessment to evaluate the specific areas of focus, particularly in relation to the industrial policy. However, we also acknowledge some limitation in our research. Our challenge is the data availability, which impacted the comprehensiveness of our findings. Additionally, our sampling was focused on selected nickel provinces in Indonesia. Moving to the schedule of our research, we started the research in Q2 2024. From April to May 2024, we began with the secondary data collection phase. In June 2024, we conducted a site visit to Southeast Sulawesi and also in Jakarta. And from July to September 2024, we entered the data collection and analysis phase. During these months, we also deepened our research and also analyzed the data that we collected. From October to December 2024, we focused on the report writing, consolidating our findings, drawing conclusions, and also formulating recommendations. Finally, from January until today, we reviewed and published our report. In our analysis, we focus on the three key provinces in Indonesia, where the majority of nickel mining and smelting activities are located: Central Sulawesi, Southeast Sulawesi, and North Maluku. Of these provinces, we conducted an in-depth site visit to Southeast Sulawesi during this study in June 2024. Some initial findings based on our second initial analysis, and also some interviews that we conducted in Southeast Sulawesi and also in Jakarta. We found out that from the nickel mining and smelter, there is the emerged information that we found out, which is the insufficient of recognition of the environmental, social, and governance or ESG standards. While there is growing awareness of sustainability, the implementation of comprehensive ESG framework is still lacking in Indonesia. Another issue is the entrenched use of the captive coal power plant in mining operations. So most of the mining operations in Indonesia, especially the smelters, is using coal. This is we discussed with the Indonesian, with the companies and also local governments, because the coal in Indonesia is quite cheap. So coal is like the best option for them for the energy resources. However, the challenges to transition to other potential clean energy resources and improving the environmental footprint is still a big challenge for Indonesia. From the local government officials, particularly from the Southeast Asia provincial levels that we have interviewed, like the former governor and also the head of districts, we found out that the economic impact of the nickel mining on the region appears to be mixed. They mentioned that the industry has brought some development to the region, but however, the broader benefits are not as extensive as they're expected. The second one, they're also concerned about the labor market, particularly in terms of the skill mismatch, job quality, and also the local workers. Finally, they also mentioned about the poverty reduction impact to for this several locations of the nickel mining and smelters in Southeast Sulawesi. They highlighted a gap between the profits generated by the mining sectors and tangible improvements in local living standards. So it's not positive spillovers there. From the local universities, we found out there are growing demand for mining study program. It reflects somehow the increasing needs of the mining sector in Southeast Sulawesi. Again, this is in Southeast Sulawesi. However, there is a problem in the local universities because there's still lack of the subject matter experts of the lecturers for this specific mining subjects in these universities. However, there are also some potential support from the other partners and also particularly from China. They keen to support with providing the high-skilled trainings and also some subjects. Basically, they provide it also through their own training center inside their smelters companies. Other than that, from the community leaders that we visited, they also argued about the pollution concerns is always raised by them. They said the local community have the big environmental damage caused by the mining activities in the areas, and also the health impacts, including respiratory issues and also potential other results from mining operations. The next one is the income replacement for communities impacted by these environmental issues. They argued that the compensation and alternative livelihoods have not been adequately addressed from these mining and smelters companies in the region. Industrial associations, the perspective of industrial associations, They said there is a recruitment for the recruitment process. They said there's a zonation mechanism, like meaning if you are near to the smelters or the mining areas, you can be the first priority for having a job. But however, they said it's not it's very difficult because most of the workers are coming from outside the regions. Mostly they come from Java even. The next one also they said they agreed that the lack of the local human capital in these regions. Finally, they also mentioned that the impact of the economic benefits in terms of the food supply is challenging because even the food supply like eggs, rice is not coming from their local resources, but still coming from outside the Southeast Sulawesi, mostly from South Sulawesi, from Makassar, or maybe also from Java. Moving to our findings, based on our visit in Jakarta, we discussed with the several related ministries and also state-owned enterprises. They said yes, the mining, critical minerals, and also EV supply chain is still central for Indonesian governments. They're keen to develop the broader development agendas and also the roadmap for this one. And also they mentioned about the Indonesia batteries and EV strategy. They're actively trying to develop the plan, particularly for the production of battery in Indonesia. From the Australian embassy, we found out that the commercial linkage between Australia and Indonesia remain limited if we are talking about the mining and also smelters, particularly in nickel. However, the embassy also emphasized the potential support for deeper Australia-Indonesia partnerships in the future. We also have an opportunity to discuss with the two other embassies, which are the Japanese embassy and also South Korean embassies. So the Japanese embassy highlighted the interest of Japanese car manufacturers in Indonesia for the EVs. However, they said the approach from the Japanese companies they describe as the wait-and-see strategy, because they're still monitoring the policy and the landscape of the market involved before they make a decision for their potential investments in Indonesia. From the South Korean embassy, they revealed about the policy uncertainty in Indonesia, particularly for EV and battery manufacturing sectors. They also highlighted about the local content requirements for one of their company that invested in EVs, which is the Hyundai and Kia, because Indonesia applied the minimum 40% of local content requirements for the EVs, and they're keen to increase it by 2026 up to 60%. So it's in the agenda. But however, the South Korean embassy also mentioned most of the South Korean companies remain interested in the battery and also EV manufacturing opportunities in Indonesia. From the private sector and also from the research institutions in Indonesia, they observe some challenges regarding the policy coherence among several cross ministries in terms of the mining, critical minerals, and also the EV supply chain in the country. Finally, they were also we found out they were also highlight about the need for a more detailed EV implementation plan. So several stakeholders emphasized the needs of the importance and clear actionable roadmap for Indonesia to develop for their smelters, nickel related, and also the future EV supply chains. About the findings on industrial policies, first, the critical mineral and downstreaming. We found out that the Indonesia actually this come up during the discussion with the former Vice Minister of Indonesia when he visited in our office. So he argues that maybe Indonesia would like to implement the divestment of foreign mining interests to have more control in several mining concessions in Indonesia. The second one also the implementation of export bans. The third one, the government is offering more important incentives for capital goods and technology to support the development of domestic processing industries. Finally, we found out foreign investment incentives such as tax concessions is also in place to attract international companies to invest in Indonesia's mining and also mineral processing sectors. From the EV supply chain, yes, Indonesia has implemented the local content requirements that we also confirmed with the South Korean embassy. The second one also, like the mining sector, there are also some foreign investment incentives for the EV supply chains, including the tax import concessions and also exemptions that are supported by the Indonesian government. Finally, from the adoption, we found out that Indonesia also introduced some consumer benefits, such as the subsidies and also non-financial incentives to encourage the adoption of EVs in the countries. So I think I let Rob to take the stage now to explain more details on the analysis.
Thank you, Hillman, and thank you all for coming. Leading on from Hillman's quite extensive analysis of the kind of policy situation around both the downstreaming in nickel and other critical minerals, and also in the EV supply chain, I'd like to just go through some data analysis we did for the project. So looking here, we've got the United States Geological Survey's estimations of nickel production from the top nickel producers in the world. So we see from this chart here that Indonesia has rapidly become the largest nickel producer of raw nickel ore since about 2015, 2016. That was around the time the export bans were implemented. Now, Indonesia is undoubtedly the world's leading raw nickel ore producer, but they are also now supplying upwards of 50% of global refined nickel to world markets. Looking forward, so another key statistic at a high level is that when we look at greenfield foreign investment statistics for the battery supply chain, EVs, and critical minerals, Indonesia has actually now become the third highest recipient of greenfield foreign investment globally. So only China and the US are have received larger amounts of greenfield foreign investment. So for those of you who don't know, greenfield foreign investments are the creation of on-the-ground facilities with the investment. So it doesn't include things like mergers and acquisitions and things like that. So it's really a better indicator of where supply chains are going to expand in the future with with capacity for production coming online in the future. So then,
what's the definition of greenfield in that table?
So basically, it's greenfield foreign investment projects. So investment in Indonesia that is creating new facilities from those joint venture projects.
In each of these sectors?
Yes, yeah. So that's the sectoral breakdown, and that's the amount for each sector, and then that's the total amount. This is basically based on a data set called FDI Markets, and they tag their investment, their data points as related to EVs, battery supply chain, and critical minerals. So that's what we chose. They also have other tagging systems like for artificial intelligence and things like that.
So China's fairly low because it doesn't include domestic investment, is that right?
Yeah, this does not include domestic investment. This is foreign direct investment. Yeah. I'll come back to the investment story soon. So looking at the export bans, we see here from Indonesia's own data sources that there were pretty significant disruptions to nickel ore production around the export ban. So in 2014, nickel ore production actually fell by estimates of 60 to 85% after the introduction of the first export ban. This was around the same time that a lot of the investment incentives were brought in around developing the downstreaming industry, so building out nickel smelters and bringing in the capital and import incentives. So we see in 2017 there was also a partial relaxation of the nickel and bauxite export bans, and then as production ramped back up, there was a reintroduction of the full nickel export ban in January 2020. There was a much smaller decline in production around that time, so about 10% production decline in 2020. That was also caused by disruptions from the pandemic. So it's very difficult to determine the causal reasons for that production decline. However, we suspect that the export ban was responsible for a partial amount of that decline. However, we see now nickel ore production has boomed since. So that's in large part because there's been a huge influx of foreign investment into nickel downstreaming. So the number of nickel smelters has actually increased from 2 in 2016 to over 60 either operational or under production in 2023. So there's been a massive increase in the ability to process raw nickel ore within the country, and that's allowed nickel mining to supply those smelters. Looking at the export picture, so nickel ore can be processed into several downstream products, and that has two particular uses that we're interested in. So raw nickel ore produced from what's called rotary electric kiln furnaces can be used to produce what's called nickel pig iron. That's used in stainless steel production, and that was initially what a lot of the smelters targeted. So we looked at the exports for stainless steel and iron production in Indonesia, and we see roughly about the 2018 that as some smelters came online, exports began increasing, but there's really been a dramatic increase in the value of exports at around the time of the second export ban in 2020. That has also plateaued, however. So we also looked at exports of nickel products. So this includes nickel matte, which can also be produced from rotary electric kiln furnaces, but they require further refining. That is a product that can actually be processed into class 1 nickel products, which are used in EV batteries. So the nickel matte exports took a lot longer to increase as the further processing and refining investments took time to come online. That category of export also includes what's called unwrought nickel, which is the class 1 nickel product. So there's been an introduction of smelters called high pressure acid leaching since around 2020. They started being constructed, and I think in 2022 the first ones came online and started producing. So that produces what's called a mixed hydroxide precipitate, and that can be more easily refined into these class 1 nickel products that are used for EV batteries. We've actually seen a breakdown in those nickel exports. They're starting to be class 1 nickel as one of the subcategories exported out of Indonesia. So there's certainly starting to be what we would say a move up the value chain in the nickel industry. As you can see, however, those exports have largely plateaued since about 2023. So that's kind of in line with what we would expect in after a global commodity price shock from the war in Ukraine, but also in light of a slowing Chinese economy and also slowing EV demand globally. So we looked at basically the fundamentals for other critical minerals in Indonesia, just at a high level. So nickel, Indonesia has 42% of global reserves of nickel. Now there's differences in the quality of different deposits, but I won't get into that. Simply because the large share of nickel here is not basically a property shared that across any other critical minerals in Indonesia. So the next closest one is bauxite, where Indonesia global shares are about 10%. And then we see other minerals that have been touted for downstreaming and targeting by the Indonesian government, such as copper, lead, manganese, tin, zinc. There aren't even records of deposits that will include global shares to the degree that nickel has. So cobalt as well is now, so Indonesia is now the second largest producer of cobalt behind the Democratic Republic of Congo. But that is a direct result of the high pressure acid leaching smelting. So cobalt is only able to be extracted from the same deposits that the nickel is in through this new smelting technique. And that smelting technique has basically been only driven by Chinese companies. So it was pioneered, I think, in West Papua in the early 2010s, but didn't reach commercialization potential until a bit later. Looking, I guess, at other examples where we can see Indonesia has applied downstreaming. So I'll go back here and we can see that we also have the mine production for bauxite. Bauxite experienced the same kind of disruptions that nickel saw, but never saw a takeoff after export bans were introduced. So I believe the nickel export ban and the bauxite export ban were both introduced in January 2014, and we saw both production of both ores collapse. Then the partial relaxation and somewhat of a recovery both in the production of both ores. Only the nickel export ban was reinstated in January 2020, and you see the blue line there, bauxite ore. The production continued increasing and stabilizing. However, more recently, I think it was in June 2023, the bauxite export ban was reintroduced, and we see another fall there. So going back to this slide here, this is again from that source I talked about, the foreign direct investment market. So this is tracking greenfield foreign investment flows into Indonesia. So after the export ban in 2014 and the signaling of the Indonesian government to pursue this resource national policy, we actually see investment into mining and metal processing in the country collapse outside of steel and nickel. So even with the export bans introduced for bauxite, there wasn't the requisite flows of investment needed to build out bauxite processing in the country after the export bans. However, there was in steel mills and ferroalloy processing, and in non-ferrous metal production and processing, which were focused on the stainless steel and then the processed and intermediate nickel products. So bauxite, which would have been another case of downstreaming, has not had the same impact. Bauxite downstreaming. Looking here, we wanted to look at what the impacts of downstreaming were in the provinces where this occurred. So we actually got, we were able to access district level growth rates. And now these are quite astounding. So some districts were actually had in individual years economic growth rates above 100%. So very acute, very concentrated growth here. But then, then we looked more broadly at the provinces in which these districts are located. So we looked at basically their share of national real GDP. And so that actually did increase, but not by much. So combined, the three provinces that these districts are located in, so Southeast Sulawesi, Central Sulawesi, and North Maluku, their share of national real GDP was 4.2% in 2010. That has risen to 5.9% in 2023. So just as a comparator, Jakarta itself as a province contributes 16.7% to real national GDP in 2023. Also, we looked at the contribution of these provinces to Indonesia's growth rate. So the contribution of the provinces combined was only 0.3% of the total 5.1% growth in 2023. So not 0.3% of that, but they contributed the 0.3 percentage points to that figure. So it isn't a significant growth driver in the scheme of things in the Indonesian economy. Now we looked at investment realization in the economy. So there was a temporary boost to construction investment over the period where nickel smelters were being built out. So that's expected. There's also been a pretty a strong rise in mining investment in the economy, and some investment increases in metals. However, when we look at the aggregate investment growth figures for the country, both total investment realization and gross fixed capital formation on the right-hand chart, we see no real strong trend away from the kind of stable growth levels that they've experienced since 2010. So this suggests that domestic investment was only reallocated to these downstream sectors rather than new investment being created. We also looked at things like labour creation in these provinces, poverty reduction, and other statistics. So for poverty reduction, the provinces that contain the nickel districts basically saw no increased poverty reduction according to what you would expect for trend with Indonesian provinces. So there was no kind of notable poverty reduction from these industries. Also looking at the permanent labour impacts, there was none to be observed. There was a temporary boost that these provinces contributed to national employment growth, but only over a short amount of time, notable like 3 or 4 years. So that is kind of the aggregate economic benefits that can be gleaned from the descriptive statistics. We also found that there's pretty serious environmental, labour and health impacts. So some studies have estimated that output losses may be around 387 million from pollution, and that 234 million of that will be individual income loss. We've also seen the same study estimate pretty significant impacts into the billions of dollars from labour productivity losses. from the health impacts to workers. So that's increased sick leave taken from respiratory illnesses, from working in environments where worker protection is not adequately addressed. So when we went over to these provinces, we were speaking with the Labour Association, and they said just for one of the smelter sites, out of 20,000 workers, 1 in 5 were reporting mild to moderate respiratory illness, created basically from breathing in fumes when they don't have the adequate protections basically to avoid those harmful impacts. So pretty meager economic benefits overall from the industry when we look at the kind of local level impacts. So the Indonesian government has increasingly linked the downstreaming in nickel with an EV strategy. So they want to become a key node in global EV supply chains. So how successful has that been? Well, actually seems to have been a pretty successful gambit. So Indonesia now accounts for about 75% of EV-related foreign investment into the region, greenfield foreign investment. So that's a pretty substantial figure, especially considering that Indonesia isn't the largest vehicle exporter in the region at all. So this suggests that there has been there may have been a pretty strong linkage between the downstreaming in nickel and then the interest of foreign companies in investing in the Indonesian market. There's also a whole host of investment policies and consumer subsidies that the Indonesian government has introduced. But I'll talk about that in a second. So this is just a comparison of the vehicle exports in the region for 3 of the main vehicle exporters. So you can see here that Thailand is exporting a significant amount more than Indonesia. Indonesia is actually only the 22nd largest car exporter in the world and is only exporting about 1/3 of the value of what Thailand does. So to me, that suggests that the EV-related investments that have come to Indonesia are not actually to be expected in a base case scenario where they didn't have a downstreaming in nickel. So I don't think you would expect such a significant concentration of EV investments into Southeast Asia without a downstreaming policy in nickel and the kind of requisite benefits that would create in cheap inputs for EV batteries. So I'll come to the relationship with China now. So the reliance on China is pretty significant. So about 90% of the nickel smelters that have been brought online rely on Chinese investment and Chinese technology. So there isn't many other foreign companies from, say, South Korea or Europe. Basically, none of them operate nickel smelters without a joint venture project with a Chinese company. Chinese trade with Indonesia has also boomed at this time, and the chart I showed before, which showed the increase in stainless steel and nickel exports, the majority of that goes to China. So Indonesia hasn't successfully started exporting these products from their downstreaming industry to other markets in a significant way. And that seems to be the driver of the stagnation in export growth. As imports to China declined quite substantially, Indonesia actually increased their import share in China, but that still led to a stagnation of exports. So I believe for the nickel imports in China, that fell by 20% since June 2023. So pretty significant decline in the demand for nickel in the Chinese market. However, the Indonesian share of those imports continued to grow as Chinese producers relied increasingly on the cheap Indonesian nickel coming out of the smelters from these joint venture projects. China is also now by far the largest greenfield investment partner in Indonesia. So it overtook the US in 2015 and has only been increasing its share of investment projects in the country. You can also see that Indonesia's two-way trade here grew quite substantially compared to most other major trading partners. So Indonesia's industrial policies here have brought about a pretty strong dependence on China as a partner in this process. Now, also looking towards the domestic situation here. So I've just looked at the growth rates across a few key indicators in Indonesia's vehicle industry. So production, built up exports, knockdown exports, and retail sales. There's been pretty consistent negative growth across all of these indicators for the last few years in Indonesia. So this suggests that the automotive industry is actually in somewhat of a downturn. So that it's going to be quite difficult for Indonesia to build out an EV industry as the broader automotive sector is kind of flailing here. Domestic EV adoption is also lagging behind regional peers such as Vietnam and Thailand. So Indonesia only had 17,000 EVs sold in 2023. That doesn't suggest that there'll be a scalable domestic market in the near-term future without pretty significant policy intervention. Electric motorcycle adoption is also very slow compared to other comparable countries like India, with really large two-wheel vehicle markets. Total exports of EVs in 2023 were also only 1,500 units. So that was less than 1% of the total overall exports of vehicles from Indonesia in that same year. So EV exports have not scaled either at the moment. So we can see here EV industry is starting to see pretty significant investments, but it hasn't been built out to a significant extent. It's still in a nascent stage. So the Indonesian government, if it wants to pursue an EV strategy, has done well linking the downstreaming industry here, but there's still a long way to go before Indonesia becomes a competitive EV player. So thinking about, I guess, the strengths and weaknesses and then the opportunities and threats going ahead. So Indonesia is now the largest nickel supplier in the world. Nickel is like a very important input for EV batteries. There's strong government commitment to the strategy for both downstreaming and the EV supply chain, and there's large FDI inflows into both these sectors. So some of the weaknesses were the inadequate ESG standards that are really weighing on the net economic benefits of downstreaming in some of the provinces. There's a dependency on a single market, China, which is seeing a pretty slow, a weak demand going forward with its economic slowdown. And Indonesia is facing a pretty underdeveloped EV market at the moment. Global nickel demand is forecast to increase quite substantially in the long term. However, there's currently quite a substantial short-term downward pressure on nickel prices. And that is in part because of the large capacity of nickel smelters in Indonesia pushing down with such a large supply of processed nickel. There's a large potential global and domestic EV market. So EVs seem to have a long-term potential for sure. So the peak in combustion engine vehicles has already occurred in 2018 or 2019 globally. So I think we're going to see a structural transformation where EVs continually become a larger share of global vehicle demand going forward. So it looks like this is a pretty solid bet in terms of the vehicle market, the global vehicle market. Indonesia also still has a limited window with the demographic dividend. So focusing on a manufacturing strategy such as EVs will help boost its ability to capitalize on that. Some threats going forward is rising protectionism. So I'm sure you're all aware that there's been quite a substantial amount of drama around global EV markets and supply chains. Notably, the EU and the US have slapped on some pretty high tariffs to China. So that is not a good indicator of Indonesia's ability to navigate the global EV market going forward, especially given the concentration of China in its supply chain. There's a growing demand for strong ESG standards. So I'm sure you're aware that there's been one example of this actually is that BASF and Eramet, two major chemicals manufacturers in Europe, they had basically started an investment project for nickel downstreaming in North Maluku. They've both pulled out now based on concerns around the ESG standards in Indonesia. So Indonesia's ability to diversify may be limited. There's also going to be strong competition from other countries. So I mentioned that Indonesia is receiving most of the EV-related investments into Southeast Asia. Both Vietnam and Thailand and also Malaysia, they all have EV strategies at the moment and are seeking to attract EV investments and build out their own supply chain. So there's going to be pretty strong competition, not only in the region, but elsewhere. Brazil and Turkey also have EV industrial policies. This is going to be quite a competitive space going forward. So in that context, what are our recommendations at the moment? So nickel and EVs should definitely remain the focus. We think that there's much less of a case for applying downstreaming as it is to other critical minerals in the Indonesian context. So I think with the case of bauxite and even a weaker case in other critical minerals, downstreaming is not likely to work as well as it did in nickel. This would also give the Indonesian government space to really address things like greening Indonesia's industrial policy, so improving the ESG governance, which would help the net economic benefits of the industry to the local populations. We also think that stimulating domestic EV demand and maybe creating export incentives for companies in the country would be beneficial. So at the moment, the consumer subsidies available are only available to models that are meeting local content requirements of 40% or above. We think that removing that requirement for consumer subsidies would help boost EV demand, as that only applies to 2 models at the moment. And then looking at diversifying economic partners. So Indonesia has made steps in this space. So they're trying to facilitate joint venture projects between Chinese companies and European and American companies to build out nickel projects and smelters with a more diversified outlook. There was a floated suggestion of expanding the divestment policy, not just from mining, which occurred back in 2009, but actually expanding that to the downstream smelting side of the industry. So forcefully divesting foreign investments from China and then either holding onto that as part of a nationalized process or allowing other foreign companies to come in. We think that may not be a sound strategy. One of the reasons is after the forced divestment in 2009, there was actually a collapse in foreign investment in the mining industry. So you'll remember on a previous slide, I had a total investment realization. And one of the sectors that I looked at was mining investment. Mining investment has massively increased since the 2009 mining law. So that is actually to plug the gap of the collapse in foreign investment that's occurred from the divestment policy. So I think it's likely that a forced divestment policy will also see foreign investment flows fall quite substantially in the downstreaming industry, which would then require domestic resources and domestic capital to plug that gap. So I don't think forced divestment is the right move here. And then staying competitive in the long run. So this is a more general approach for building Indonesia's manufacturing to be a bit more competitive. So there's been a few studies that show that local content requirements have been pretty restrictive in the Indonesian context and haven't led to a competitive manufacturing sector. That was specifically for the vehicle and automotive sector, but also for more generally manufacturing. So we think the Indonesian government would do well to look at trying to reform its manufacturing sector to remain a bit more competitive. It has a very early lead in EV investments, but in the long run, if it doesn't make its manufacturing products a bit more competitive globally, we think it may face some medium-term pressures from other EV exporters. And then this is just the acknowledgement. So thanks for a lot of the stakeholders we spoke to, both in Indonesia and in Australia. And also this project was part of the Amazon think tank network. So we thank them for their support in this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, let's open up now to for questions and comments. Start with Marcus.
So 2 questions, if I may. First is probably the most controversial about who is actually benefiting from this massive increase in export of nickel. There was debate between late Faisal Basri and Claude about to what extent actually the profits just flow back to China. So you said 90% of the nickel smelters are having some sort of Chinese investment. Do you have any estimates about where does the profit flow? Does it stay in the country? Does it flow back to China? Can you contribute anything to that politically quite sensitive debate? And then the second question is about the figures for EV investment, which you said are pretty high, I think it's like $30 billion or something. Can you tell us who these investors actually are, given that Tesla isn't really investing? This is largely the South Koreans. So can you give us a profile of who is hidden in those $30 billion?
So for the first one, so the nickel smelters and the downstreaming, part of the industrial policy has been massive tax concessions, tax holidays, etc. for these investments. We suspect that we don't have any actual estimates or data to support this, but we suspect that most of the profits are being repatriated. We think that there's a broader governance issue, especially with when we went there, like local government officials struggle to gain access to these smelters. So we think there's a broader issue here around governance with how these companies are operating in the country. But yeah, so given that there's been a huge boom in this industry, but there hasn't been any increases in aggregate revenue figures for Indonesia, we think, yeah, it's pretty likely that most of the profits are going elsewhere. The government isn't obtaining much revenue from this so far. I will say, however, there are encouraging signs. So Indonesia has revoked some of the tax concessions to the rotary electric kiln furnace projects. So a lot of the ones that focused on stainless steel and nickel pig iron rather than the nickel matte and the intermediate nickel required for EVs. Those have actually had a lot of these concessions revoked now. So that's an encouraging sign. So industrial policy is very typically criticized for having entrenched political interests supported. And basically, this shows that the Indonesian government is kind of serious around, withdrawing support for some of these projects. Again, how much of those profits won't be repatriated back to the companies that own this, it's very hard to tell. On the EV-related investments, yes. So the concentration in the downstreaming in nickel is much more acute with a huge dependence on China for technology, capital, and joint venture projects. In the EV space, there's a much bigger presence of South Korean firms in the battery sector. There's also a huge amount of investment from Taiwan as well into battery inputs and other sectors to do with EVs. So they're much less reliant on China specifically, but it's still concentrated over a few of the East Asian kind of economies.
Dika.
I think my question, thank you so much for the presentation. I really learned a lot. I think my question is around if this is going to be the Indonesian government strategy going forward. So industrial policy, strategy, this is like towards like green transition. And to what extent part of that policy they're thinking about green transition? I can see how this is going to be very different to the initial manufacturing back in the 80s, like a lot of textile, they will employ more female workers, but how does it look like in this space? Like this EV industrial policy strategy? And to what extent government has even ever thought about, like having their policies to increase more women in STEM, starting from high school, and then making sure that they have really capable.
Yeah, thank you, Dika, for the questions. Yeah, as of now, we found out that this is a new for Indonesia. We're talking about the nickel smelters, EVs. So based on our analysis in the region, in the Southeast Sulawesi, there is no particular strategy if you're talking about the women yet, but they considered actually this is coming from the local government initiatives. So they're keen to see this is the booming of the nickel smelters and EVs in the region could have like positive spillover effects for the regions. So meaning hopefully the women can work the demand for the other potential that can provide it by the regions, like the food supply or maybe the like the clothes supply, that kind of thing could be like handled by the region itself, which is creating new potential labor markets in the region, which could be like the potential of the women entrepreneurs and also women participation in the labor market. But as of now, if you're talking about specifically in the area itself, like the mining, smelter, and EVs, is is still very limited, we can see. Even the limitation of the skills is still very high, like the gap between the skilled workers and also the unskilled workers. We can our previous article also argued that even the local workers coming from the specific region, they only working for during the infrastructure projects. After the smelters companies operating, usually they don't get any potential jobs because the lack of skills and some other issues. Also, the potential the skills of Indonesian compared to Chinese workers is very different. So some of the local governments officials also mentions some critics. They said that even when the Chinese workers are working, while the Indonesian workers just take a break for smoking. So this is like a lot of things that need to improve by Indonesian government in terms of the local competency and also the skills.
For those asking questions, please speak louder because we have online audience as well. Eve.
I can speak loudly. Thanks, that was fascinating. So I have a question about district growth. So the figures you showed, if I'm not mistaken, were from 2015 onward, and you get this really clear data suggesting that growth in these districts where the mining and the smelting is happening is much higher. You get these spikes, but you also, in general, it's higher than in neighbouring districts, and it's much higher than the national average. One question I have is whether you didn't present it, but whether you looked at comparing growth at the district level during this boom in downstreaming and exporting, compared to the previous boom in nickel exports when it was raw nickel. So do we know that growth is higher in a downstreaming boom compared to just the old style boom? Because I feel like I looked at some of this data a while ago. I wasn't sure whether the data was right, but it didn't look that different. That really surprised me because it really runs contrary to the whole theory that downstreaming spillovers, it generates a different kind of growth. And I'm just not seeing that it does, even though it looks different.
Yeah.
So that's one question. And just one other, and maybe the answer is partly your answer to Marcus's, but that FDI story is really dramatic, data point there that Indonesia is attracting like 70% of greenfield investment in the EV sector now. What was the time frame? So I guess it depends a little bit, like if these other EV sectors are more mature, those other countries, then I guess it's kind of logical they won't get attracted to much of this greenfields investment. And if it's in just 1 year, like is it just a couple of projects that are driving it? I can't remember, I don't think you have the year up there.
No.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, sorry. So for the downstreaming point, so we only had data for 2015. So that was the district level kind of data that we had to when we accessed. So that comparison I'm not too sure about. What I will say is that like even though those, I think the point that I want to drive home is those growth rates look quite quite substantial. However, investment and things like that also come into those figures, and there's been a huge influx of foreign investment just to build out these smelters. So I think that the lack of kind of additional impacts on labor markets or poverty reduction suggests that yes, this kind of growth model is highly concentrated. It's not having broad spillovers that you would expect to see with such dramatic growth rates. And I think as well, when you're looking at just the provincial level, the kind of small contributions these provinces are still contributing to like national growth and like the increase but small of like share of national real GDP. It suggests that this growth model is highly concentrated with like minimal spillovers.
It's like the raw commodity.
Yeah. Yes. So I think the trick is definitely that there needs to be kind of converting this type of growth into broader kind of spillovers to other labor markets. So what Hilman was saying before, we think like some other strategies that the Indonesian government could pursue is like, forcing these companies that supply like lunch and food to a lot of the workers, if they're forced to supply that through from local suppliers in the area and things like that, but also like reducing the kind of negative spillovers. So a lot of the impact to say like agricultural output looks quite negative from a lot of the tailings and the pollution from these industries. So addressing that will then like increase the broader economic benefits to the region just simply because it reduces kind of impacts to output elsewhere. On the time frame, so I didn't have a time frame there, but that was for as long as the data source has it for, which is 2016 to 2024. So it is over a long enough time span that I would assume that this is suggestive that supply chains for EVs are going to be firmly concentrated in Indonesia going forward. There is definitely investments and pretty significant ones elsewhere. However, I think that given that there's a much larger value share of EVs is concentrated in the battery itself, given that Indonesia has such a lead here in that subsector of what the EV supply chain requires, that it is kind of indicative that there will be a lot of the value of EV production in the region going to Indonesia.
Okay, my list has grown, so I'll make sure I cover you. So Sarah, Hal, gentleman at the back, behind Marcus, Katie, and then Jane, and then we have some online. So I'll take two at a time. First, Sarah and Hal. Sarah, you go first.
Try to be quick. So related to dependency on China, I just wonder if you can explain a bit more why both the investment and export of nickel depends so much on China. Why compare with other governments like Korea, Japan, and China is not afraid of policy uncertainties? Is it because they have such a big EV market, they need a nickel, and then when they make the nickel, they export everything back to China? If so, why wouldn't a country like US do the same when they are a big EV producer?
Okay, hold on.
So thanks, very interesting. So I'm gonna make the skeptical case on this policy. It's the sort of thing that I've written about a lot, by the way. So the rationale originally was twofold, as I understand it. One was to actually increase the returns to Indonesia of its possession of a valuable natural resource, i.e. nickel. So Indonesia has that natural resource, which it's valuable, the world wants. The question is, does Indonesia maximize its value from having that natural resource by enforced processing, or could it just have a tax regime which maximizes returns to Indonesia? It's not at all clear that the processing route is the way to do it. And we know from evidence from Indonesia earlier in the log export ban that in fact the log export ban way back before you guys were born actually produced negative value added. It was dissipated in inefficient downstream processing. I suspect the same thing's happening, and we need to know. Quickly, second point, as the basis for creating an integrated EV industry, I'm also not convinced. I see the graph which others have referred to, which looks kind of impressive, but you've got to see it in the context, which I think you alluded to earlier, which is that Thailand was the early mover in automotive production in Southeast Asia, and nothing's going to really change. It has the network of producers that Indonesia doesn't have, because Indonesia went the sort of domestic value-added, local content route. I don't think it's going to change. And of course, nickel is only a very small part of the total, EV production costs. So seems to me on both those grounds, my skepticism remains. But thanks, very interesting presentation.
Okay, let's tackle them first.
Okay, so maybe I'll talk to
Alexandra.
you do on China.
Yeah, doing China first. Okay, thank you, Sarah, for the questions. Yes, when we're seeing China is the main investor in Indonesia. Our initial analysis, we found out because of the approach of the Chinese investors in the country. The second one is like the Chinese availabilities of everything. So Chinese has the money, so they can invest. Chinese have the technology, they have the HPAL, so they can build the smelters, which is required by the Indonesian government. The third one is also Chinese has the market. So they combine everything from China. That's the differentiated, the difference between the other potential European Union or maybe the US investors in the nickel and also the EV sector in Indonesia. Even though we also found out that most of the nickel processing after the smelter is like 90% exported to China.
Yeah. So yeah, on the returns from natural resource investment. So yes, agree that it is kind of disputed whether that's the best strategy to force processing within country and then export those processed goods. So I think my understanding of the evidence is that nickel had the most prospects for drawing the most value add, out of any other critical mineral, even though that was marginal. So I think the study that was done in 2014, I'm referring to, I think it was by USAID, and unfortunately their website is now down. So it's I think you can get it through going through Web Archive. But they suggested that Indonesia would struggle to force downstream processing in all these critical minerals, and that the marginal economic benefits from this would not be substantial across the board. By their estimates, Indonesia was not going to be as successful as they were in nickel. So I think that I would say that their estimates of the benefits from nickel processing are probably below what actually happened. However, I would say that, yeah, absolutely, it's not hugely substantial and it's not transformative. So I think the combined exports for stainless steel and nickel for those two categories were 35 billion in 2023. So reasonably substantial, but still not transformative. But I would definitely lean towards that position for all the other critical minerals that they're thinking about applying downstreaming to. I think bauxite is a key area where they're seeing like absolutely no domestic processing even coming towards them. So their processing capacity and like export of processed bauxite, alumina and aluminium, not going to be anywhere near as substantial as just say a better tax regime on that. So I think on the nickel, maybe the case is that Indonesia has been much more successful than some of the estimates would have suggested. And then on the EV investments, yes, take your point about Thailand having all the input suppliers and a more established vehicle kind of industry already. I will say, though, that based on those figures, even in the subsectoral breakdown, so automotive original equipment manufacturing investment is higher in Indonesia than it has been in Thailand.
So what percent is in total cost is nickel? It's very small, isn't it?
Sorry?
What percent in total EV production cost is nickel?
I don't have those figures off the top of my head.
So
Some goes to the battery, some for the stainless steel one on the body.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's small, yeah.
Yeah, it's absolutely small, but having like cheap nickel input is important for nickel dominant battery chemistries for sure. And that's certainly where a lot of the EV companies are focusing. I think it's quite difficult to attribute this kind of influx of foreign investment, greenfield foreign investment from EV companies to anything other than the industrial policy strategy here.
Okay, gentleman at the back, then Katie.
Thank you both for your presentation. I want to ask you a bit more about the local content requirements, because from what I've seen, that's been applied in a really lenient way. Like right now, you can meet the 40% figure purely through local assembly. You can have 0% local content if you're just doing local assembly and you meet the 40% target. So this seems like pretty light industrial policy compared to what other countries around the world are doing. And if you remove that, if you just let Chinese imports flood the market, like does the Indonesian automotive industry then go the way of the textile industry, which is sustained collapse? So yeah, what's the justification and the rationale for saying they should get rid of those?
I'd just like to ask, are you specifically only focusing on Chinese investment in nickel? Because I was puzzled as to why you left out Timor and South Sulawesi in your analysis. But also, just to make a comment to the woman asking about women, by contrast, I don't want to sound like an advocate here on capitalism, but excuse me, but Saleh actually employs a large amount of women, and it's growing over the years, and they use women operators. And I'm writing about this at this very moment, and I speculate that it's because at that level of multinational mining, you had a huge movement starting in Australia, actually in the Pilbara, with companies having to accord to other kinds of employment policies, the moving women into those roles as operators and so on, which spread to income, which then was taken up by farmers. So that's an interesting thing about how women's employment improves in the industry. But why did you leave out? Is it because you only wanted to look at the Chinese industry?
Okay. Okay, maybe high level about the local content requirements. the main agendas from Indonesia government, of course, they would like to open the new jobs, new industries in Indonesia for having these local content requirements. But however, based on our discussion, particularly with the South Korean embassy, so they said there is like specific calculation for these local content requirements. So if it's mentioned like 40%, so there is like, I think it's under the Ministry of Industry. So they have like the list what kind of parts of the cars that can be counted for this total 40%. But it seems like we don't know the details, but it seems like applied for the cars as of now, including the EVs, and also not only for the car manufacturing, for the other part of the sectors as well, like the mobile phone and other stuff. In terms of the benefits for this local content requirements, yes, we also thinking about not to push it again, because we are thinking like maybe if the government push the local content requirements, the main challenge is whether Indonesia is like have a capability to develop by their own, and whether the price is like cheaper compared to the one that can provide it by the other countries, like maybe like imported from Chinese factories for the specific contents. So this is like still a big questions, which very unfortunate we don't have like any deep dive analysis for the local content requirement for our research on the EV and the nickel.
Yeah, just quickly on the local content requirements. So I definitely wouldn't advocate for just like a shock therapy style removal of all these protections to the industry and then just let it play out. I do see the practicality that you would probably just be outcompeted by a flood of Chinese vehicles. So there were indications that they were going to continually increase local content requirements to a pretty high percent, like 70% or something. And yes, it's a flexible regime, but I think increasing these onerous requirements on companies can lead to more inefficient production. So one of the reasons Thailand is a much larger vehicle exporter than Indonesia is because that they use cheaper and higher quality inputs across the board for their input manufacturers and for their vehicles. So I think that a more liberalized manufacturing sector in Thailand is a good example of what can be kind of the aim of these reforms. Certainly not advocating for just a complete liberalization and a shock therapy style reform agenda to manufacturing, and it needs to be, thought out and well implemented. But I think that certainly increasing the quality and increasing the price competitiveness of, say, inputs to these EVs will go a long way in ensuring that Indonesia stays ahead for this industry. On the South Sulawesi plans. When I looked at the data that we were given by the Indonesian government, the smelters in South Sulawesi were not operational and they were under construction. But I'm not sure if that's true based on what you're saying. Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah.
That's one of the things which goes into the downstream production for batteries.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And a lot of the things you talked about, the last time I looked at the data, combined with Pemekaran, where Lulu was carved out of Lulu, again, I hate to sound like an effort, but not, we help. But the income coming into Lulu, Timor, has made a huge difference in terms of the development of that province. And last time I looked at it, it was making this, because there was a big fuss in the provincial government in Sulawesi Selatan about enforcing the fact that, in spite of the fact that, the laws after Reformasi and all that, to make sure that the money came back to South Sulawesi. And as I understood it, it's seen as significant. I mean, it's very different from what's happening now in Sulawesi Tenggara, where it's real kind of cowboy development. It's very different kind of animal to what's now this really established, thing in Sulawesi Selatan.
Yeah. So yeah. Look, I think we are not aware of that case actually. So like we should definitely look at that.
Say that your report is about Chinese investment, because if you say I looked at it a little bit, and I think that's what you're talking about, which is slightly different from the whole picture.
Yeah, absolutely.
You took Fare and Lulu Timor into account. And
Is the,
yeah, yeah.
so the South Sulawesi operation for Vale like compared to say Central companies?
Yeah,
It's
but
a
in
small
terms
amount.
of some of the questions, well, but no, but it's just that if you're going to have a map that says,
Yeah.
excuse me, I'm not, if you're going to have a map that says nickel mining and smells across Indonesia, and you only have southeast, central and northern, that's wrong, that's a mistake. That's what I'm saying.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not saying anything about volumes or whatever, but also I think there's interest for me, what you said, that
She's right.
the table about the impact on districts and provinces raise questions for me because what I know is happening somewhere else. That's the point I'm making. And also it's clearly very different on the issue of women's employment.
Okay, I'm sure they,
Yeah, yeah.
Not that, I mean, the Vale does a good job, but I think you actually go to the operations in other places. When you walk around, you actually see all the
We were also looking at the industrial policy that's recently been introduced with the export bans. So that was why we're focusing on the impact of that. So smelters that are like kind of built a long time ago, we weren't focusing on those because we were looking at what the industrial policy from 2009 and 2014 primarily on had done. So that was certainly why that may, but we've definitely not come across that. So thank you. We'll definitely be looking into that.
Yeah.
And on the Vale thing, very good to know that they're employing a lot of women in that. So we do understand that is definitely a focus that we want to look into.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Katie. Jen, then Paul, and then we go online. Jen.
Thanks, really great work. I'm going to ask a tricky Trump question. I'm not expecting that from you, Rob. But, you know, building on Sarah's point about diversification, it's always very easy to say too dependent on China, need to diversify, then you start thinking about who to. I mean, it's also reflecting, I don't know quite who's monopoly capitalism you're referring to, but I think the bigger question is how does any foreign investment ultimately come in and benefit the people, and that includes the women. So if they're, whether that's Chinese or not is one thing. But surely Trump, you know, you've mentioned, I know when you published it, so you've done most of the writing before January, but just in the last couple of months, and I am looking at some of your final policy recommendations here saying that they should increase trade with the EU and the US in the market for EVs, when Trump is now standing up next to Musk and saying buy Teslas, but also, you know, a reduced Chinese presence in at least some nickel operations when just this week ANU has lost funding from the United States because of research that is also funded by China. Like things have gotten much messier, and I suspect much more troubling for Indonesia in this industry alone. Does any of your thinking change basically in the last months in terms of those some of those policy recommendations, and you know, in particular, which of the other countries is diversification really the key, or is it more to Sarah's original question? You've got to make sure any foreign investment is well utilised, and particularly when there's one country that's got the money to spend, that has the demand. You've said that has whose growth is slowing, but is still growing and much bigger than just about any other country in the world.
Thank you, Jen. Paul.
Thanks, Devon. It would be good to hear more about taxes and subsidies. Rob, you mentioned tax data is very typical, but it seems quite key, right? At the downstreaming point, tax cuts and some subsidized inputs, is there more to it? It would be great to hear more about that, and any data would be useful. Also, I just felt during the presentation that it would be useful to separate out more clearly the upstream from the downstream. These interventions, we should expect some downstream stimulus or activity as a result. But what has been quite interesting is the increase in production of this commodity at the mining level. So as upstream as it gets. And exactly why? Is it because the downstream processing is so heavily subsidized that's created local demand that has gone back upstream to increase the mining output? Or what, is there more going on? Was it quota increase for the production of nickel ore in Indonesia? What's the story at the very upstream level? And just briefly to add, I mean, Indonesia is now much stronger than Saudi Arabia in the oil market. Indonesia is in the nickel market, I mean, about half of production. That's amazing. They've crushed the world nickel price somehow. And the exact story of why this production story in terms of ore output happened is still, I think, somewhat untold. But now that they're not quite happy with that, right? I mean, a lot of price is hurting them. So now taking some steps in the other direction, hopefully will help. Thanks.
Okay.
Next question.
Over to you.
Okay, so to the Trump question, yeah, so we actually had recommendations for negotiating divestments down of Chinese joint ventures to below like the IRA threshold. That's now all been thrown into question, so we've taken that out of the paper. To the extent that EV demand declines in the US or companies are no longer going to be needing nickel for EV production in the US, I think it's very uncertain at the moment. However, I don't see, except in maybe extreme downside scenarios, that demand disappearing. So I think involving US suppliers that need nickel and trying to diversify exports to send there to the extent that EV demand continues is necessary. So something we didn't talk about there was that EV battery chemistries is somewhat changing, but that's being driven by the Chinese market. So over 90% of EVs sold in the US and in the EU are still the nickel dominant battery chemistries. And that's predicted to decline slightly, but still remain largely dominant. So I think supplying the nickel to the EU and the US companies is pretty critical. So China, the US and the EU will be accounting for over 60% of vehicle demand going forward. So I think it really is important that Indonesia really tried to diversify from the Chinese kind of side of things there, just simply based on the mechanics of demand for the kind of EV batteries that they're targeting. So what that form takes, very uncertain, I think. And yes, there's a lot of kind of uncertainty around Trump. I think that the Indonesian government has been involved in trying to get US suppliers to invest in joint projects with Chinese firms and things like that. That is probably unlikely to go ahead. So yeah. So I think I think it'll be a matter to see how things play out. But I think that underlying demand for nickel is probably going to remain for the US market. So, okay, for the tax data, yeah, we didn't actually have detailed tax data. We didn't look into that. So we were looking more at the kind of more macro effects there, and we weren't able to determine, I think, robustly what the effect and the marginal impact was of different policies. So we know that the tax subsidization is massive, and that's been a big attractor. But I also think that the export bans had a lot to do with this. So when you have 42% of global reserves, and that aligned with the technology of more efficient REKF furnace processing along with H-Power, that allowed Chinese companies to, it basically forced Chinese companies to see a huge benefit in investing in that market. And I think that underlying fundamental doesn't exist in other ones. So I think it's difficult to determine the causality here. But yeah, I would love to see more evidence on that. But I think we kind of had to limit the scope to what we had based on our time restrictions. For the upstream versus downstream, I think it probably is as you said, a subsidized industry basically had a huge build out of smelters, and going from 2 to 60 smelters and then a massive export boom in those industries, I think does create a lot of the demand for the local ore. So I think the supply of that ore is necessary. There was, I think, reports a few years, maybe in 2023 or something, where there was actually not enough nickel ore to go to the smelters, and Indonesia was having to import nickel ore from the Philippines. So I think that suggests that the demand created for nickel ore by this downstreaming industry is massive, and then that production of nickel ore, the mining production, has increased to meet that. So that would be kind of my assessment of it.
Okay, let's take a couple from online.
Yeah, so we have 50 participants joining online, and there are so many good questions here, but I'll start with the first one. It's from Frankie Simanjuta. So based on the data you presented, Indonesia is currently receiving significant increase of investment related to EV manufacturing. What would you see in your analysis as the next step
in Indonesia EV industrializations, considering Chinese EV industry is likely moving out from nickel? Do you see that Indonesia will increase their investment strategy to other countries like Korea, Tesla, or European? And so go to the next one. And the second question is from Arya Yudi Satria. Could you explain more about you're saying about pulsing downstreaming? So because I do think like building an industrial ecosystem in Indonesia is important, but I'm not sure if banning or export is the right way to go about it. So what do you think would be a good way to help grow a strong industrial ecosystems here? And the third one, it's from Chanya Butsayatur. What about domestic energy conglomerates exclude of foreign parties? Is the energy market in Indonesia competitive enough to stimulate inclusive growth, not wealth generated from green growth concentrating in a few domestic corporations?
Over to you.
Great questions. So I'd say so the EV next steps, certainly a large part of that is going to be creating the demand for, say, the downstreaming nickel through EV production. And I think that domestic EV consumption needs to be increased. So having only 17,000 unit sales in 2023, that really needs to increase if Indonesia wants to kind of stimulate a broader manufacturing boom in this industry. So I think for EV next steps, certainly looking at increasing incentives or expanding incentives for domestic adoption and things like charging infrastructure access, they need to be looked at a national scale to help with that. On the export bans, so I think with the contrasting case of bauxite, where we haven't seen, say, export bans that were like roughly congruent with the nickel export bans, bringing in substantial investment for bauxite processing and like bauxite ore production kind of still hasn't really recovered from the export bans. Yes, it's a very regressive policy. I think it worked in the case of nickel and is unlikely to work elsewhere, just simply because of the kind of large nickel reserves that Indonesia has relative to elsewhere in the world. And I might leave the domestic energy question.
So we didn't analyze about the energy specifically, but from our analysis best for the energy, the challenge is like Indonesia will continue the coal. So because the reserve of coal is like still huge there, the reserves. So, and also the coal is the cheapest option for Indonesia, and also for providing the subsidies for the energy by the coal for the smelters as of now. Although again, I agree with Katie. Vale is also give like good examples. The Vale in Pomala, they said they would like to implement the renewable energy, so instead of the coal captive power plant. So we keen to see that if this is like the led by the Western, even though the Vale is also collaborated with Chinese for their industrial park in Pomala, but they keen to push the renewable energy for supporting their energy. The other things also, we had discussion about the energy mix in Indonesia. So it seems like the renewable energy seems like a big questions. Currently, the last discussion about the price of the energy, like to the transmissions, because led by the Indonesian state-owned enterprises in PLN, and whether the option for the private to let the energy is like another challenge for Indonesia. So this is like the big questions. But again, for all the energy conglomerate in the country, particularly for coal, it seems that Indonesia will continue for coal for a while.
Okay, I still have Pak Budi and Chris.
Thank you for the presentation. So number one is a bit general, why you talk about nickel mining and EV rather than nickel mining and battery, because it seemed to me that it's a long change to go to EV. You mentioned that we don't talk why Arab do not produce car. Second is that on the field, linking up this industry, you seem to be focused on the export ban. but your data showing that export increasing, keep increasing. So exactly need to be clarified how much is actually the export will be increased without a ban, because if not, then it doesn't matter actually ban or not, because it's typical in Indonesia. Even there is a ban, people also keep smuggling outside. And then so it seems to me the fail is on ability to absorb labor because of training and so on is not working. So maybe you might want to focus on analyzing, because I heard that in Morowali and so on, they built this academy and so on to prepare labor. So what happened with them? And the other aspect that about mining, which is open mining is possible, is this artisanal mining. What happened with the artisanal mining? That typically a mechanism to distribute to the local economy because of the downstreaming industry. Are they becoming restricted? And what have, clearly understanding that probably will improve our understanding why the leakage is actually from mining activity is not going to the local.
Thank you, Mas. Chris.
Yeah, very interesting talk. You mentioned the limited labour market effects. I wonder if you can unpack that a little bit. And there are a number of dimensions. One is local versus imported labour coming from other parts of Indonesia. A second one is service industries that are supported by the boom, and again, to what extent is that provide jobs from elsewhere in Indonesia? Hal mentioned the boom, the timber boom years ago in the 70s, and a lot of that labour was from Sulawesi into Kalimantan, and those were quite important issues locally. So I wonder if you might just expand on those issues.
Thank you, Chris. Maybe just short.
Yeah, no problem. So for EV midstream battery question, so Indonesia is the first country in Southeast Asia to open multiple EV battery manufacturing facilities. So whilst yes, the kind of capital intensity of that industry means that it's taken a little while for that to, I guess, develop. We're seeing pretty promising signs that there will be substantial capacity brought online for that. And I think that is indicative of a lot of the manufacturing investment for a final vehicle manufacturer that's also come in. So they suspect that EV batteries will be able to be supplied to the models that they're building. On the export ban, so sorry, remind me of the export ban question.
So will be the increase of export without ban?
Yes, yeah. So we're not able to do the counterfactual analysis for this project, unfortunately. So I can't answer that in any robust manner. I might just leave that there. So yeah. Do you want to take the artisanal mining and
I think I take the labor.
Yeah, labor.
You can do this.
Of that one?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So artisanal mining, yeah. So my understanding is there was a crackdown on artisanal mining, and that has probably limited benefits to the local economy as well. It is actively being restricted. However, I haven't seen much reporting on that in the last, say, year. So I think there was a crackdown, and when we were there, my understanding was that a lot of artisanal mining was being shut down. The extent to which that's continued, I'm not sure, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think Labor Academy, yes, agree, but there is like improvement in the several industrial park. They're open their trainings, and also the center, the academic center, and also even the specific smelters company also open their training center inside the smelter to prepare for the next generation, ready for the smelters and also the future of the nickel in the country. However, we also found out about thank you, Chris, for the insight. Actually, this is our findings as well, but unfortunately we cannot get the data about the movement internal movement from the Java to the Southeast Sulawesi workers, because the negative finding was they said it's easy to get the local identity card. So even if they're coming from Java, they went to the specific region there. They just asked to, they try to create the local ID based on the address in that region, so they can get that ID and then they can apply for the jobs there. So it's calculated as, this is like a big question, whether this guy calculated as a Javanese or Javanese coming to this area or the location, because some of the employment, they require the local workers. So that's how they do it as of our discussion with the labor associations. Beyond of that, we cannot compare about how many Indonesian companies compared to Chinese companies, because we just heard a lot of Chinese companies coming, Chinese workers coming to the regions and compared to Indonesia, but we don't. Very unfortunate, the data is not available.
We have passed our time mark. My apologies to those online whose questions cannot be answered at the moment, but we'll make sure to share those questions with the speakers. And with that, please join me in thanking our great speakers. Thank you. Thanks, Rob.